What does it mean that God's power is perfected in our weakness? Is there a deeper meaning? Why would Paul say something like this in regards to the suffering that he's going through? Let's look at the scriptures to find out how God's power is actually perfected in your weakness. So here we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul talks about how God's power is perfected in our weakness. So Paul is talking about specific visions and great things that he's seen. And in verse 7, he says, "So to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing," he's going to say, "greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited." So twice we see this concept of being kept from conceit at the focus of this passage. Paul's saying, I had great revelation. God has shown me amazing things that most people don't get to see. So to keep me from becoming conceited. And this is the main point so far up to this, up to this section, is that conceit, preventing that, is at the heart of what God chooses to do towards Paul. Because of the surpassing greatness of revelations, Paul could have grown very arrogant, very prideful, very much boasting in these things and feeling superior to people, and even develop a kind of self-righteousness. But to keep Paul from developing that due to these great revelations, God allows a thorn to be given to him. This thorn is going to be the focus here of what it means that God's power is perfected in our weakness. So Paul has this great revelations. With that, not only comes great responsibility, but often as well, a great need to remain humble, which is what a thorn allows him to stay in, is humility. A thorn was given to me. And what is this thorn? Well, let's say this. We know it's given. We know it's in the flesh, okay? We know it involves a messenger of Satan, and it involves Paul being harassed, right? But again, God's ultimate purpose in the midst of this, in the midst of a messenger of Satan coming to harass, this is the enemy's purpose, right? The enemy has a purpose: to harass, to ruin, right? To destroy, to steal, to kill, but God has a greater purpose, right? And I'm going to highlight that in blue. And it's I'm going to highlight that in the salmon color, to keep Paul from becoming conceited. So this is the enemy's purpose: to harass Paul, to ruin Paul, to break him down, to discourage him. This is God's purpose right here. God's purpose. And it's very important that you see that up front, because God's purpose triumphs and trumps any purpose of the enemy. Here's what Paul says about this thorn. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this. About what? About this thorn, that it should leave me. So what does Paul specifically plead with God about? I pleaded that essentially God would take this thorn away from me. In other words, whatever it is that he has in the flesh that is harassing him and involves a messenger of Satan, it's a thorn, it's something that pricks him and bothers him and is a very big inconvenience, very uncomfortable, right? He prayed that God would take it away, which means it could have been taken away. But look at what God says. This word "but" here tells us, but, even though I asked God that it should leave me, but God said to me, no, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. So let's see this. Weakness all of a sudden comes into play. So I wonder if the thorn in the flesh is what Paul means when he says weakness. Is a thorn in the flesh involving harassment and a messenger from Satan, and something that's bothersome, inconveniencing, uncomfortable, something Paul is saying, please, 3 times, take it away, God. Is that a weakness? And the answer seems to be, yeah, that's what he's referring to. In fact, he goes, God says, my power, I'm going to highlight this in blue, my grace and my power. What about his grace? It's sufficient. It's enough. What about his power? It's made perfect. It's realized. It's accomplished, right? It's actually put on full display in your weakness. So in this context, the weakness of Paul that he's trying to pray away, God, take it away, take it away. This weakness, very simply, is anything that we have zero control about, zero control over. I can't do anything about it. I'm cornered. I'm helpless when it comes to this thing. I rely on God to do something about this. Maybe it's some kind of fleshly weakness. Maybe it's some kind of emotional weakness, some childhood trauma you've been through, or something that you just simply you have no control over. It happened to you. It's something that's in your life. This weakness seems to be a platform for God's power to be perfected and seen through. So he says, therefore, in other words, Paul responds to what God says. Here's how it works. A thorn is given. Paul responds, please take this away, 3 times. I pleaded. He's begging God. But God responds, Paul, my grace, my favor is sufficient for you. It's enough. My power is made perfect in weakness. In other words, whatever it means that God's grace is sufficient for Paul, it involves God's power being made perfect in weakness, which reminds me of Romans 8. God works all things together for the good of his people, even in our weakness, even in tribulation, even in persecution. So this weakness that Paul has, God is saying, I'm not even going to address that right now. My grace is the focus. My grace towards you to endure this, to bear under it, to deal with it, to even get through it. My grace is sufficient. It's enough. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. In other words, even though Paul has a weakness, even though he has a thorn, that doesn't eliminate the sufficiency of God's grace. It doesn't diminish the sufficiency of God's grace. In other words, Paul has no less reason to be content and satisfied and say God is enough just because there's a thorn or a weakness he's dealing with. He says, therefore, he responds to this statement, and it seems as though he's changed. I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses. So something changed in Paul. What changed? Well, God spoke and gave him clarity and perspective about his thorn and his weakness. What did God say? Well, it's a platform for my power. My grace is sufficient even though that thorn is still there. That doesn't eliminate or diminish the grace of God's sufficiency in my life. He's still enough. He still satisfies me. He still fills every gap and every deficiency within me. And that's the point of this power here. The power here, or the weakness, doesn't offset the power of God in my life. It doesn't counterbalance God's power in my life. It doesn't ruin or diminish God's power in my life. Actually, weakness becomes a way in which the power of God is put on full display. If we can say weakness is a display case like you'd walk by in a mall and see something on display being advertised to you, the power of God wants to advertise itself through human weakness, through those things we can't control or do anything about. So Paul says, I will boast, not plead that God would take it away. I will boast. What a shift. What a shift. I'm going to highlight this in salmon, okay? Instead of pleading, right here, now he's boasting about the very thing he asked God to take away. He says, I'll boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses. So that, or here's why, here's the reason, so the power of Christ may rest upon me. In other words, there's more power in my life, more power put on full display, more power impacting people and people becoming aware of because of the presence of my weakness. So weakness doesn't distort or disrupt what God wants to do in my life through his power. It actually plays perfectly into God's plan. It plays into my favor and God's favor in terms of his power is going to be seen more clearly. And I'm going to operate in that power because human weakness, these things that make us dependent on God, really drive us to the throne to access the more power he has for us. If I don't have weakness or a thorn to make me aware of my deficiency and dependence on God, then I won't run to him for the power he's made available. So the power of Christ rests upon him, he says. For the sake of Christ, then, I'm content. So what did God say? My grace is what? His grace is sufficient. So what can Paul say? I'm content. What is he content with? Weakness. Now specifically, up to this point, Paul has talked about all the different ways he's suffered. He's endured hardship. He's been persecuted. He's endured pain and heartache, physical too. All the kinds of ways he suffered for the gospel. This is what he has in mind when he says weakness or thorn. I think it refers to the insults, the hardships. These are not only examples of human weakness or things Paul can't control or do anything about. He can't change these things. These are actually what he means by weaknesses. The insults that come, the hardships that come, the persecutions that come, the calamities that come. Can Paul control what results from his faithfulness when he serves for the sake of Christ, when he operates in the power of God, when he leans on the grace of God, when he walks faithfully as an apostle? Can Paul control what results from that? Or does God control the fruit and the outcome of our labor? The outcome so far for Paul seems to be, I have a lot of insults and hardships and persecutions and calamities, weaknesses, you might say. But when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So you go, Paul, why are you boasting about your weaknesses? Paul, why are you content all of a sudden when you were pleading, God, take this away, then I'll be okay? And now you're saying, I'm okay even if you don't? Why are you content with your weakness and you're not content once God takes it away? He says, here's why. Here's why I can be equally content in the midst of weakness as I am if God were to take it away. Because when I am weak, then I'm strong. So you ask yourself, how does God supply his strength and his divine unlimited power to his people sometimes? Often it comes through human weakness, those situations, those things in life we can't control or do anything about. I can't change it. All the power and authority and influence and reputation in the world, all the money, none of it could change these things. These are weaknesses. And God tells Paul, no. You're strong when you're weak. That seems like some kind of weird guru statement that makes no sense, but it does. Because when you're weak, you rely more on God and you see more of his strength. If you don't recognize your weakness and you don't lean into that and admit that, if you kind of play it off or deny it or think you're autonomous from God and independent, then you're operating in the limitations of human strength, and that can only take you so far. But when your weakness drives you to the throne to experience the strength God provides, you can experience a kind of strength that no amount of human effort could ever have achieved or given you. So weakness, thorns, what results from our own faithfulness that we have no control over at times, insults, hardships, learning to be content in the midst of those weaknesses, learning to lean into those weaknesses and boast about them because they drive us to the strength of God, that's what a believer needs to do. God is no more or no less sufficient for me, depending on whether or not I have weaknesses or thorns in my life. So Paul's going, you're right. He is good. His grace is enough. His power is at work, even in the midst of, and even because of my weaknesses. In other words, Paul is more aware of the sufficiency of God's grace. Paul is more leaning on the power of God and stronger because of the presence of weakness. So what God doesn't take away is actually to our benefit because it makes us stronger, not just in developing us and sanctifying us, but in keeping us dependent and humble and reliant and desperate for what only God can provide, and that is his strength. Listen, if you want to learn how to read the Bible, maybe you are frustrated when you read the Bible, you're bored, you don't know where to start, you're overwhelmed, check out our free 40-day Bible study program linked in the description below. It's completely free, it's online, and it's self-paced. You can see those programs we have at abovereproachministry.com. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and do that and hit the bell so you can be notified of any future videos that come out. And check out abovereproachministry.com. We have completely free Bible study courses, a 40-day program, a 27-day, and 11-day program, all kinds of free resources. You can get a copy of my book. You can join our online church. You can get some merch. We have a bunch of stuff at abovereproachministry.com. And it's also linked in the description below. Go check that out. And thanks for watching.